Good evening, and welcome back to Drawing Journalism. I am your host, Laura, and today's episode will be about journalism during winter. No, that's close, but it's journalism during the Cold War. You will also get to learn about journalistic frames. And remember, if you have any questions at any point, I have a Google form in the description below, and I'll be answering all questions on the last episode of Drawing Journalism. So, for any of my new listeners, in the previous episode, we learned that I had terrible humor, and you can imagine I'll have some of that in this episode as well. Additionally, we learned about how the media calmed citizens down and had them join war efforts for World War II. Well, almost immediately after World War II came the Cold War. And it's a war where the Soviet Union and the US fought with the space-based nuclear testing and nuking islands. Well, I'm sure journalists will love reporting about this, but let's find out. So, nothing new, a little background to get started. The Cold War was all about political tension between the Soviet Union and the US. The tension started in 1947, and there were 9 presidents during the Cold War. The first being Harry Truman, and the last ending out the Cold War was George Bush. I will not be explaining all of these presidents because I'm trying to keep the podcast time under 15 minutes. However, I will be going over one president, and you probably know his name, Kennedy. I'll be going over Kennedy and Nixon later in the episode. However, back to the background. During the Cold War, the US was trying to contain Soviet and communist influences in the countries in Europe, such as France, Italy, and Greece. This led to the US having a policy of containment, which is blocking the expansion of Soviet influence, basically containing it. Fun fact, some Cold War came from a US journalist called Lippmann, that's his last name by the way, who put it in his newspaper and made the term popular. Originally, it was called the War of Words or the War of Ideologies. Lastly, many people moved from listening to radio to watching TV. Right at the beginning of the 1950s, television dominated the broadcast media. Television was used by many, and you'll see why later in the episode. So, stick around. Hopefully, it'll get warmer. So, what was the popular thing during this period? Propaganda? Gossip? Fake news? Well, there was actually a new type of journalist called Cold War correspondents. They were journalists who moved to capital cities in different countries to see how countries lived and why they had different values. Moscow was the most popular place for US journalists during the Cold War, since this was the capital city of Russia. These correspondents wrote a journal at the end of their assignment and published them. However, these journalists were kind of like propaganda. The Cold War correspondents that went to Moscow had confirmation bias, where you search for and interpret information in a way that confirms your prior beliefs. And this is exactly what happened with the journals that they reported. The journalists didn't really make an effort to explain the actions, they just reported their thoughts, which caused some skewed opinions. This was unintentional propaganda because it showed the Russians in a bad light. However, this did help the US citizens stay away from communism. It was actually a big effort to make sure Americans didn't become communists. The bigger one of the efforts were making anti-communist movies to encourage the end of communism. If you want to watch any of these movies, watch Arctic Flight from 1952, Diplomatic Courier, 1952, My Son John, 1952, or Trial, 1955. These movies can give you a further look and feel on how Americans felt during this time of fear. I have no clue where to find these, but try YouTube. Speaking more about television, You can imagine that it wasn't very clear during the 1960s. Many people had television, but television didn't have the best quality during this time. Why was this an issue? Well, in the 1960s, Kennedy and Nixon were running against each other. The TV was used a lot during this process, a couple debates being on television. Some people thought that the television impacted the political process. Additionally, Kennedy looked better on TV than Nixon because of the lighting and the fact that Nixon looked old. Why does this matter? Well, many people watching TV thought Kennedy had won the election because he looked better on TV and he won the first debate. However, those listening to the radio thought Nixon had won. In the end, Kennedy did win, but the TV caused a lot of confusion during debates and any political event. Another thing you need to know is journalistic frames. In journalism, frames are how journalists fit stories into newspapers and tell their readers how to interpret the news based on existing knowledge and values. The Cold War frame was a broad frame into which stories of conflict could be simply but often misleadingly fitted to enable the media to narrate a story in an established form of discourse. This frame caused stories that were unrelated to the Soviet Union and the US to have a theme of communism, terrorism, and propaganda. An example of this is the South African fight for freedom, which was framed in a bad context in the US because nations like the Soviet Union, China, and Cuba supported the national liberation struggles in Southern Africa. However, this fight in Southern Africa was not about being pro or anti-Soviet. Still, the media depicted it this way, and it was intruded on. The Cold War caused journalists to bash other countries to let the public know that they did not support the Soviet Union. Bashing other countries caused the readers to gain a negative view of these countries that might not even be involved in communism, like Southern Africa. However, this wasn't seen too much as an issue since the war in Africa was not directly affecting the US. I would like to point out a modern example of how this affected Americans completely. Whenever you think of Russia, what do you think? Well, some Americans think about all the bombs and propaganda from history, as well as secret science info from Stranger Things. This is kind of a skewed opinion on Russia because it was big in the Soviet Union. However, a lot of Russians aren't like this. A lot of Russians are really nice, and not those soldier guys you see on television. The reason why I'm explaining you this is so you can see that these historical events are still affecting us to this day. Anywho, back on with the information. Another event that happened during this period was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had secret missiles in Cuba to attack the US. What could go wrong with this? Well, what happened is there was a war. This lasted about 13 days, and it was the closest the US had ever gotten to a nuclear war. The public was panicking. But how did the media respond? Well, they made sure to get the money out of it. They got on with the story. They used everyone's fear and panic to sell more newspapers. The US citizens were more informed during this period than they were in World War II because of the television and less censorship being practiced. Additionally, I wanted to point out some cool information. Do you remember in episode 3 how we talked about the radio and how the radio was loved? These radio talks were praised because they could not misrepresent or misquote. The radio broke the boundary of misinterpreting words and speeches. It was a new hot item. Well, this was the same with television. Kennedy addressed the country through television and radio during the Cold War. This made him really popular among all the groups and even the Republicans. Kennedy's speeches were seen as legendary because he was one of the first presidents to use television in order to get his speech across. He was also a really good public speaker. He provided a nice, strong voice during a time of panic and fear. At one point, even the Republicans started helping him. However, not everyone liked him. Sadly, Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. The last thing I'll talk about is how the civil rights movement was displayed in media in the 1960s. A big part of the media during the 1960s, when it came to the civil rights movement, was how the media showed the demonstrations and brutality. We know in the past that the media has always censored brutality and anything that might be sensitive. However, the media could not skew the inhumanity that came with the civil rights movement. Fun fact, Martin Luther King actually wrote for the New York Amsterdam News in 1962. The column highlighted King's views on contemporary issues, including the efficiency of nonviolence, the state of civil rights movement, and the role of the church. Now, did the television really help the civil rights movement? Actually, it did. The media was able to spread awareness of the injustices going on within the Black community. I know in the past, the media has not always positively shown events. However, I can say this for a fact that it's positively shown the civil rights movement, and it really helped the civil rights movement take off. Thank you for joining me on Jarring Journalism. The next episode will be about news on television. Don't forget to subscribe and have your questions answered by submitting questions down below in the description. Lastly, visit my Instagram page to get reminders and extra content on media and misinformation. My Instagram handle is @jarringjournalism, and this will also be in the description. This is your host, Laura, signing off.